Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode, the first of a new season, our sixth, focuses on leadership. Leadership, thought since ancient times to be critical to the destiny of nations, has long been a feature of military training and elite education, but its arrival as a staple of workplace training was relatively recent. Donald and John explore the work of the thinkers who, from the middle of the 20th century onwards, developed theories and critiques of leadership learning.
If your actions create a legacy that inspires others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, then you are an excellent leader. Welcome everybody to this episode of Great Minds on Learning, the first in a new season, our sixth. And this time our theme is leadership, as that motivational quote I just read out, attributed to the great Dolly Parton on the webpage where I saw it anyway, will have tipped you off. Donald, leadership is a staple of workplace learning, and it's easy to find pagefuls of motivational quotes about it. In fact, the whole field of leadership studies can seem from the outside like a collection of fridge magnets, and maybe nowadays it really is a subset of the self-help industry, self-help for overachievers. You can see I've collapsed into cynicism already, and that's no way to start a new season of the podcast. So, Donald, give us an overview of what you're going to tell us about today, this group of theorists on leadership. Something suitably inspirational, hopefully. One thing I noticed is that they're all quite recent, 20th and 21st century. So is it Taylor who kicks all this off, and Taylorism? Taylor we studied in the episode on instruction lists, if people want to look at the back catalogue. Or is it Taylor they're reacting against, maybe?
Well spotted, John. It is indeed Taylor and the famous phrase Taylorism. I'm actually a fan of Taylor, unlike most people who use it in a sort of pejorative term. But that's absolutely right. It does. We covered Taylor, of course, in a previous podcast. You're also right in spotting that the people we're going to talk about today are all from the US and all fairly recent. And that's because leadership theory, actually, as applied in the workplace, is very recent. Actually really only took off in the 70s, really in anger in the 1980s. All the people we're going to be discussing are Americans, of course, because that's where it came from. To be fair to the Americans, however, not only did they give us a lot of quite bad stuff, I think, around leadership, exaggerating its efficacy, real evidence that this leadership training in all its different fridge magnet, I like that analogy, its fridge magnet manifestations actually works. That's one of the big problems here. But not only did it come out of America, so the people we're going to be tackling today is the guy who started it all off, Burns. And then the big name here in the early days was Drucker, of course. I'm not such a big fan of Drucker, but he has some really interesting ideas. And then we have situational leadership with Blanchard and Hersey, and the 1 minute manager and all that sort of stuff. It was all very sort of, a bit lightweight, but nevertheless, that took purchase and took root. Then it started to, in a sense, diverge out into different forms of leadership theory. We have Kotter, who saw leadership in terms of change management with his famous 8-step theory. But then it got really interesting. And we're going to end on three people who I really do like. And one is Mintzberg, and then Kellerman. So that's the one woman in the list here from Harvard, and Pfeffer, because they were quite critical of this old school leadership stuff. They thought that people got incredibly carried away with themselves, and that the potency of this one abstract noun had got really out of hand. So going back to your fridge magnet thing, and then maybe we could just briefly discuss Taylor a little bit around this. It is a world of rhetoric, popular books, and really bad courses. I mean, I think that's my view of it, having studied this in a fair amount of detail. But the good roots of this, actually, as you rightly said, were Taylor. And I suppose at that time there was no leadership. I mean, when I first came into this industry in the mid 1980s, leadership was a word nobody ever used. Management training was certainly an important thing. But if you, we'll come to Kellerman later on, but she makes the point that actually leadership for most people historically was, well, if you go back to Plato in the Republic, that was the first real commentary. She recommends you read the Republic, in fact, around leadership. Plato said that, you had to be at least 50 years old before you could become a leader, which wouldn't go down well on a fridge magnet these days.
Yeah.
But the idea of leadership was Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan type thing, and even negative, and Napoleon Churchill, that sort of thing. Great national and global leaders was the exemplar. And that great man theory of history, which Kellerman criticizes, of course, is we have vestiges of that, the charismatic view of leadership. But she says leaders were also negative. People like Stalin and Hitler would have been, we would use the phrase like Hitler led the Germans in the Second World War. And so it was a mixture of good and bad guys. Then something odd happened in the 90s and early 2000s. Suddenly there was this idea that everybody could be a leader, the very opposite of how that word was used in the real world. Suddenly Nigel in accounts needs to be a leader. How did that happen? And that's where maybe some of these theories are going to be critical. Taylor, I mean, just a quick bit of recap on him, really. I mean, he writes what is probably the most important management book ever, Principles of Scientific Management. And in that book, he says, let's base management on some empirical evidence and science here before we go any further. Now, because the workplace by that time had become very process and science driven, looking for optimal, by and large, manufacturing techniques. So he wanted to replace all that hazy rule of thumb type stuff with methods based on solid process and tasks and evidence. And then his second principle was you have to actually train people on those scientific methods and give them very specific tasks. He also believed that each employee had a role and you had to train them for that role, which was a very sort of old school view of manufacturing. And then this really important thing, the division, and he thought it was a fairly equal division between sort of supervisors and workers, between management and employees. That rift, that schism was introduced by Taylor. He never mentioned leadership. He wasn't interested in that at all. Interestingly, Drucker, who we'll come to, was a huge admirer of Taylor. Absolutely massive. But he admired Taylor, and this is why I admire Taylor as well. What Taylor actually managed to do, and remember that America still is the greatest and biggest economy on the planet. And it became the greatest and biggest economy on the planet in the 20th century because it did something no other nation did. It actually became innovative, inventive, and started to introduce mass manufacturing into the things we see in our homes now, everyday things from vacuum cleaners to dishwashers to televisions and so on. It was the world leader in that. And that was because Taylorist type techniques had been applied to industry. And why did Drucker really like him? Because he lifted literally tens of millions of people out of poverty. So a really important thing. People criticize the sort of neoliberal idea of Taylorism, but what Taylorism did was lift people out of poverty. And I think that's why I've always been an admirer of his focus on training, measurement, sort of standardization, management. But he never liked the word leader. I mean, what we've done is layered the word leader on top of Taylorism. That's what Drucker did. So, yeah, that's you were right on two fronts there: the fridge magnet thing, and secondly, Taylor as the spur or the deep well for people like Burns and Drucker to build upon.
So let's pitch into the first of the people that we're going to be talking about. James MacGregor Burns, 1918 to 2014. He was born in Melrose, Massachusetts. James MacGregor Burns was the son of a businessman. He pursued his education at Williams College, graduating in 1939, later earned his PhD in political science from Harvard University. Burns taught at Williams College for nearly 40 years. His career was marked by his contribution to leadership studies, particularly through his concept of transformational leadership, introduced in his 1978 book, Leadership. Burns was also a Pulitzer Prize winner for his biography of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Donald, did his roots in political science mean that he took a very political view of leadership?
That's right, yes. In fact, absolutely did. So this is the first big book on leadership. Well, it's called Leadership, one-word title. That's 1978. So it's really early in terms of leadership stuff. There was nothing around in this field, really, other than this one book. Now, he is really interesting because he's got one foot in this sort of historical evidence I mentioned about great leaders. And indeed, he draws upon that political well to construct his theory of leadership, what it is and how it should be implemented in organizations. So he wrote, actually before this, so way back in the day, but before this book, he had written 2 books on Roosevelt. He was a huge Roosevelt fan, thought that he was the exemplar for leadership. Political leadership, of course. One of the critiques of Burns is, although he does this leadership thing, he is so rooted in the political past that it's sometimes difficult to apply it in organizations. But not only Franklin Roosevelt, so the book's actually a really good business book because it draws upon, it's almost like reading a bit of history. He draws upon other people like Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi, and so on. And also Hitler, going back to that notion that leaders can be bad. A really important premise behind this, the idea that leadership is always good. Well, look at the leaders we have these days. I think most of the population who are in revolt against the political class, by and large, globally, would say that, if anything, there's been a pendulum swing towards bad leaders rather than good leaders. But to answer that question directly, he was really interested in these social thinkers, reformers, that notion that leadership in the political sphere has real efficacy in the real world, for good and bad. Who would say that Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot were great leaders these days? Nevertheless, they were leaders. So he was trying to uncover the sort of universal traits and behaviors of these people by looking at real examples from the past, which I think is a reasonable approach because we have a wealth of evidence around Churchill, Napoleon, Roosevelt, or whoever, However, I think that political focus, it's certainly seen by some as a limitation, because corporates and public sector bodies are very different from the political body that a politician is appealing to. But yeah, so the answer to that is yes, and then we can go on and discuss what he actually said then about leadership.
Yeah. Well, just one more point on that. I mean, does it mean that in a way his theory is a timestamp? Because I suppose received wisdom is that Roosevelt and the New Deal kind of dominated American politics and economics for a long time in the post-war era. But you get to the 80s and you have kind of Reaganomics comes in, and a word you mentioned earlier, neoliberalism, and Roosevelt New Dealism is kind of out the window and has remained out the window, although he still has his admirers. Does that mean that Burns's ideas were kind of associated with that?
That's a very good point, John. I think that's true. I think, although there are 2 sides to this. One, it's good because he draws upon, a couple of thousand years of evidence. Who were these people who was Napoleon? Who was Roosevelt? So he draws upon real empirical evidence, namely what did happen in history. On the other hand, looking forward or looking at contemporary or now, it would be fair to say that a lot of this stuff doesn't really apply to big tech companies or small entrepreneurial companies or the sort of different species of organizations we have on the landscape today. So I think that's a fair point. I think a lot of the critics of many of these thinkers, in fact, are that they don't really deal with the complexity of modern day capitalism. That would certainly be the case.
So to zero in on what he actually did say then, transformational leadership is...
Yeah, that's right.
What is being transformed? Who is being transformed, and from what into what?
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a catchphrase, really, because it was a bit alliterative. What he was criticising was what he called transactional leadership or traditional Taylorist management.
So it's a binary there.
Yeah, that's right. So not transactional, but transformative. There's your fridge magnet right there, John.
Yeah.
So, but here is a point here. I mean, it wasn't just a sort of a little ditty by him, really. His whole point was that management, by and large, had been transactional. In other words, we want to do X. I will tell you how to do X, and here's a set of goals. That transaction between the managers and the people who had to actually do the things or do the work. He wanted to raise the bar somewhat and saw leaders as another sort of species of management. He still saw them as managers. And what he meant by transformation there was that they had to really think more about taking care of the people, making motivation, the psychological dimension of management comes into play. And although his initial focus was on political leadership, one of the things he learned from people like Roosevelt and so on was that they were good communicators. They did manage to bring people with them, which led to their political success. And who would deny that Hitler brought people with him? Look at the scale of the Nuremberg rallies and so on.
Mm.
So I think that was his main point here. And I think that was this book, late 70s, 1978, was a pivotal point in leadership theory because it established that idea that leadership was about the mind, motivation, encouragement, all those psychological features. And therefore, it had a big effect. Burns was very, very famous in his day.
Is this where the sort of binary between management and leadership begins?
That binary had been established by Taylor between management and workers or employees, and now we have a tripartite distinction between leadership, management, and workers. One of the things I'm very critical of in leadership training is, why are we getting so hierarchical about all this? I thought we were meant to have flat organizations. And therefore, I think sometimes the hubris, the rhetoric, the courses, the books around leadership are way out of control in the sense that they're making it a steeper pyramid rather than a flatter structure. That's why I think a lot of it doesn't actually apply very well to contemporary organizations.
Peter Drucker, 1909 to 2005. Peter Drucker, born in Vienna, Austria, to a lawyer and a doctor, was educated at the University of Frankfurt before fleeing Nazi Germany for England and eventually the United States. So this puts him in there with that generation of people like kind of Freud and so on, the American diaspora. Obviously, Freud came to London. But Drucker went to the States. He received a doctorate in international law from the University of Frankfurt, spent much of his academic career at Claremont Graduate University, in the States, where the management school is named in his honor. He's known as the father of modern management. His career, management, no, not leadership. His career spanned writing, teaching, and consulting, influencing modern businesses practices profoundly. Drucker was not only a management consultant and educator, but also an avid art collector and a writer of fiction. Donald Drucker is clearly a really important and influential figure in leadership learning. What was different about his approach from Burns or Taylor?
I think Peter Drucker did something quite interesting. He just wrote lots of books. There's something like 40 odd books or whatever. And they were all over the airports. He was the sort of first populist management book guy, and so I think he got his propaganda right. To be fair, he never ever wrote a book on leadership. All the leadership stuff is integrated into his general broader discussions of management and organizational structures, So that's one thing in his favor, as it were. But he really brought a very formal view of what good management was, and leadership was built upon it. So it was all about management by objectives. He was a very goal-driven guy, very Teutonic. He's from Vienna, he's very from the Teutonic world, goal-driven. But he had some really interesting innovative spins on this. He invented the phrase knowledge worker, for example, and recognized that there had been a big swing away from the manufacture of physical goods towards services. He also recognized that we had, because these organizations were different, they were people organizations, not building cars, decentralization was really important. So knowledge worker, decentralization, these are concepts that Drucker teased out and presented to the marketplace. And to be fair, these are well worked out ideas and really well written books. He was a good writer. But it was the practice of I think that was the title of his first book, The Practice of Management, way back. That was the 50s or something. But when he comes into the 1970s and 80s, it's all management. It's about tasks, responsibilities, and practices. I think that was a subtitle of his book, one of his books. Very formalizing management. Now, if we turn to leadership for a moment, his views of leadership, I think what was quite interesting as well is he recognized that leadership in the public sector would be very different from leadership, let's say, in a big manufacturing company. Mm. In fact, he wrote a book in the late 90s about management of in the non-profit sector, managing non-profit organizations or whatever. And I think he had a certain breadth and depth and understood the market well. He was somebody who was out there in companies, speaking at conferences, doing research and writing lots of books. So I think in that sense, there was breadth and some depth to Drucker, the first big management theorist. For him, leadership was about just doing the right things. It was about encouraging people to manage themselves. And he was also very big on employees taking responsibility for their own actions and their own training, interestingly. Drucker was never big on this notion that we just serve up dishes of courses to people. He really did stress personal responsibility. I think it was it's interesting, we've discussed this before, something to do with these people who came out of Europe, especially the diaspora Jewish population, who a lot of this was a reaction to what they had, bad things that they had experienced personally. Mm. This notion of personal responsibility for your own working life and training, I think, is deeply rooted in that idea that, listen, waking up, guys, we've got to be moral agents here for ourselves and not just listen to what leaders say. We've had enough of that. Did you see what happened with Hitler? And the danger here is that we default sometimes into this notion that leaders are everything. Leadership is everything. And that's why I think Drucker never went the whole hog on leadership, and every one of his books had management or manager in the title.
Yeah, that's interesting though. Is there a kind of paradox there though, that you kind of distrust leaders because leadership can go bad? So it's all about the individual, but then if you're the one in charge, does that really help you?
That's a good point. There's a fundamental schism in the whole leadership thing, isn't it? It can be incredibly dangerous because there are leaders like Paula Venables in the post office recently in the big scandal who literally take the organization into very, very dark places through incompetence or perhaps ego or narcissism, or being over charismatic. There have been plenty of examples. I worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland. They were our main client way back in the day. And I saw that for real there, complete power-hungry narcissists who really took the financial system down with them. We forget that that's very recent and we're still in the shadow of that. So it's not always a good thing, leadership, which was that, which many of these theorists tease to the surface. But we curiously forget, of course, in training courses, how many people discuss Hitler in a training course on leadership.
Yeah, there does hover over this a kind of consciousness of, the dangers of toxic leadership and so on. Yeah. And on the other hand, there's another thing running here, which is leadership good, management bad.
Yeah.
All these kind of binaries that what's that formula? I'm forgetting it. Leadership is about management's about doing things right. Leadership is about doing the right thing, or
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that kind of stuff. So all the time, leadership is being kind of bigged up as the thing we really want to get. And coming back to that thing of this idea that everybody should be a leader. Perhaps we should blame Napoleon for that. Wasn't it Napoleon who said every subaltern has a field marshal's baton in his knapsack, or whatever, who kind of encouraged devolving practice of leadership down. So we're bigging up leadership all the time, slagging off management.
Yeah.
Where does Drucker sit in that, do you think?
Well, Drucker, to be fair, I think was still in the trenches on management and saw leadership as a thing. but he certainly did not exaggerate it to the level in which we, as you just rightly summarized there, exaggerate the abstract noun these days. I think it's got completely carried away with itself. I often say this, that language is promiscuous, but we often latch on to this single word like resilience, mindfulness, leadership, whatever. And leadership is an incredibly dangerous word in the sense that it can lead to good and bad consequences. And I think actually what it's managed to do, we have a whole load of sort of fridge magnet hubris around leadership. And that's what some of the other people we're about to discuss are critical of. I think it's been a really interesting introduction there with the people with Burns who really kicked the whole thing off with his book Leadership. Drucker, who was half in, half out, really had a subtler view of management versus leadership. But once we get into Hersey and Blanchard and some of these people, they are full on in the whole thing. Yeah. That's where it goes all wrong then. And I think, the problem is there is very, very little evidence that all this leadership training actually works. The evidence is as thin as gruel.
Paul Hersey, 1931 to 2012, and Ken Blanchard, no birthdays. A twofer here. Paul Hersey was born in Somerville, New Jersey. He earned a BS in social sciences from Seton Hall. That must be a typo here on my, can't really have earned a BS.
Right.
In social sciences from Seton Hall University and an MA and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Hersey's career included teaching at Northern Illinois University, where he developed a situational leadership model with Ken Blanchard. Blanchard, born in New Jersey, completed his BA in Government and Philosophy from Cornell University, his MA in Sociology and Counselling from Colgate University, and his PhD in Education, Administration and Leadership from Cornell University. Thank you, ChatGPT, for that mouthful of a sentence. Together, they co-authored the seminal book, Management of Organizational Behavior. Donald, situational leadership is actually something I've heard of and even practiced in my small way, leading small teams of marketing people. But what I've always wondered was whether it clashes with authenticity, which people talk a lot about nowadays. So the manager, the leader has to be authentic.
All right.
But surely if you're doing situational leadership, you're kind of all things to all people, aren't you? You flex your style situationally according to the people that you're leading. Can you be that and be authentic? I mean, Alexander the Great didn't flex his style.
Yeah, that's a good point. I love that little BS, that little Freudian slip there. Yeah. In actual fact, the title of one of the books we're discussing later by Pfeffer is Leadership BS, because he's highly critical of all this stuff. Nice little slip. I also like the Colgate University, that such a thing should even exist makes me smile. The Colgate University. But an interesting point about authenticity. I mean, Pfeffer was, to jump the gun a little bit here, he was highly critical of this notion that you attribute traits to leadership. He thought it was a totally ridiculous idea that there were these little essences and that leaders, if only everybody adopted them or had them. And one of them, of course, the big famous one you see in all the slide decks on leadership is authenticity. And Pfeffer has a really good line on this. He calls it the delicious irony of training people to be authentic. He thought, it doesn't get any more absurd than that, training people to be authentic. But authenticity is a big problem. Yeah. It teases the ridiculous nature of some of these courses, really teases it to the surface.
So tell us about sorry to interrupt. Yeah. I'm just eager to know about situational leadership. So model.
Well, I quite like these two, Hersey and Blanchard, because situational leadership at least recognizes that these little essences are nonsense, and that actually it's all contextualized. And so, they're quite early, these guys as well. The Management of Organizational Behavior. Remember, the first book they write is actually on management, and the 1 Minute Manager. They didn't really use the word leadership although they're regarded as the gurus of situational leadership. Actually, most of what they wrote was on the 1 Minute Manager, was their most famous book, 1982. Didn't have the word leadership in it at all. They did write a later book, so that was 82. About 2 or 3 years later, they write another book called Leadership in the 1 Minute manager, but that was more cashing in on a market rather than a serious idea of just one focus on the one word leadership. But actually what they were saying is, listen, there is no single best style of leadership. This is a ridiculous idea that these little essential oils, if only we knew what the traits of leadership were and we all adopted them, everybody in the workplace would be happy and the place would be massively productive and a great place to be. He thought, actually, they both thought that leadership was highly contextualized and that there were all different types of organizations. They thought that leadership was determined by the nature of the organization and the people who worked there rather than the people who were leaders. So and indeed they had a sort of taxonomy here, your four-way thing. They thought that there was a sort of scale here from highly delegative, so the delegating leader. That's the sort of thing you might get in the military, where it is actually necessary to be highly directive. You've got this very strict definition of roles and tasks, and you've got to supervise that quite closely because people die. It would be true of the airline industry, for example, because people have got to be very careful when they're flying planes around the place. So you have that delegation view of leadership. Then there's a coaching view that's still quite highly directive, but quite more supportive of people. And you might say that would be true in something like banks, where there's very formal process. You've got to be careful. This is people's money. You don't want them to be subject to fraud. Very highly process driven. But you've also got to encourage people and seek input and feedback from those people as followers almost.
Yeah.
So that's, get these right, delegation, the coaching idea. And then there was the third one, supporting. So this idea is that you have quite low directive behavior. You sort of stand off somewhat and much more highly supportive of the people who are working for you. So the leader's more of a sort of facilitator, that sort of language supports the workers or followers' efforts in developing themselves with an organization, and definitely a sort of shared responsibility for decision making, highly delegative. So that's the supporting thing. The fourth one is, that was supporting, is the delegating leader. And this has got, so you're not doing a hell of a lot of support. You're not giving a lot of direction all the time. What you're doing is allowing people to get on. You're finding competent, capable, willing people to do the job for you. And that's more of a thing that you might find in tech companies, for example. So that supporting one we just mentioned, you might say that's more like the NHS, where you've got to be still quite directive, but still give lots of people a lot of autonomy. But the delegating one is like your full-on entrepreneurial tech company type bar. And I think that was quite useful. What we get out of this notion that leaders are this, and they need empathy, sympathy, authenticity, trust, modesty, that essential oil stuff. At least these guys recognized that was brutally simplistic, and that people need to be flexible depending on the nature of the organization and the people who work for you. The problem is there isn't much evidence that that taxonomy is true. Again, going back to the evidence thing, when you read the books, they're really very, very thin on evidence. And you don't see a lot of studies saying, well, this really worked and we made a lot of money because we applied situational leadership. Yeah. So a lot of people have questioned that model's assumption, that notion of follower maturity. Just look at the people who work for you and adopt to it situational.
Yeah. It does feel that there's a kind of, there feels there's an emotional truth in it that, and you see this as a parent, that sort of, like, sometimes you can be very kind of coaching and accepting and all the rest of it. And then if there's a crisis, if the plane door falls off while you're in mid-flight, it's, okay, shut the fuck up, put your seatbelt on, do this, do that. I mean similarly, managing a department, and it's kind of, Monday morning, got the whole week ahead of you. Let's have a little consultation. What do you think we should have for lunch? Oh, I don't know. You decide, get the rolls and all the rest of it. Coming to Friday afternoon, we're on deadline. We've got to ship this thing. Otherwise, we're going to be here all weekend. Just do this, that, and the other. And I don't want to hear any arguments. That people, leaders behave like that. Managers behave like that. People behave like that, don't they? And so it kind of rings true that this idea of situational leadership, and I always thought that just did seem to kind of chime with the way things are.
Yeah.
Whether or not it sort of really teaches you a great thing to learn about the different styles on the quadrant, I don't know.
I think that's true. But it's one of the strengths of the situational thing that you need to explain to people that the world is complex and you need to be adaptable. But that's not what a lot of leadership courses tell you. Well, situational leadership things will focus on that, but it's a bit of a platitude. Well, it's obvious in a way, isn't it? I mean, I don't need to go on a 3-day course to understand that I need to be a bit careful and a bit flexible and adaptable as we go forward, because shit happens in the real world, as it were. But some of these other theorists that we're about to speak to really do take this seriously, especially Kotter, but Kellerman and Pfeffer as well. But yeah, I think they changed the game somewhat here, but still you have this notion that it's about the word leadership. Why isn't it just management then? If it's just this adaptability idea, why are we sort of pumping this up to the fridge magnet level when we could just be getting on with things in a calmer, more sensible fashion, rather than creating this special cadre of people who have the secret sauce for productivity and motivation? Because it's not like the parent-child situation here. I think that's a terrible thing if it's applied in the workplace. It's more like we're all in this together. It's a bunch of people who are not related who find themselves in the same boat trying to row forward. We need some delegation. We certainly need some sense of direction. But do we need a Shackleton? Not really. Not really. Not in a modern organization.
John Paul Kotter, 1947. Still among us. John Paul Kotter was born in San Diego, California, completed his undergraduate education at MIT, and received an MBA and a doctorate from Harvard Business School, where he joined the faculty in 1972. Kotter is best known for his work on leadership and change management, authoring several influential books, including Leading Change. Kotter has also founded Kotter International, a management consulting firm. Donald, I've heard of Kotter and read Kotter too in connection with change management.
Correct.
Does his inclusion here as the theorist of leadership mean that he's putting change at the heart of what a leader does?
Yes, that's right. You hit the nail on the head again, John. So he's known for change management, but actually the whole change management thing was situated in the context of leadership for Kotter. So, and two of the best-selling ever reprints for the Harvard Business Review, so were called not change management, they were called What Leaders Really Do. That was the first one, 1990. The second one, about 5 years later, that was Leading Change. Leading Change. He was all about, he thought that organizations were fundamentally, the role of management, or especially leaders, was to effect change when you had to, whether it's pivoting the company towards a new market, recognizing that the context had changed. You had to do things to make things better. Okay, so leading change, why transformational effort fails. He thought that the primary role of a senior manager, or which he definitely called leaders, was the idea of effecting this change. And so in the later book in 2008, it was called A Sense of Urgency. And his 8-step theory is really worth relating, because I think it's by far the most dominant theory of change management, which was how he defined leadership. But it's also a bit of a linear process. I'm not too sure that it's as good as people say it is. Again, coming back to the situational leadership thing, the world is complex, the world is messy. And when you have these little simplistic models, and your L&D loves a model because you can put it on PowerPoint and deliver the course. But it's certainly worth relating. I think there's some really great things. What he did was, he first of all said, don't just write a report or a plan around change management. That's a waste of time. That will fall flat. He said the first thing you have to do is a bit counterintuitive, and that is you've got to create a sense of urgency. That's the great Kotter phrase, create a sense of urgency. That might be, oh my God, we've got a serious competitor here. Or if we don't make some money soon, we're going to go out of business. Oh, we've just merged with another company. There are all sorts of species of urgency, but you have to do that first. And then a second thing, which I think he was quite cute on, was don't go herring off trying to change things without getting your little group, or what he called a guiding coalition. So you get this little group who have the power and skills to make the change. He thought that was terribly important. It doesn't happen from the printed page of the report. You need the stakeholders that will actually make this happen. So that's create a sense of urgency, build your guiding coalition, and then then you get to your vision and your initiatives. Then you define what you're going to do in terms of the execution of that vision. So that's urgency, coalition, vision. And then you've got to really do it. And that means getting your whole volunteer army in place. There's a large group of people in the organization. You really got to get it. You've got to spread the word. You've got to involve all the departments, all the heads of X, Y, and Z, or the deans of faculty in a university or whatever. And then the rest of them are really removing barriers is a big one. In other words, you're going to hit the skids here. You're going to hit bumps on the road, anticipate those and manage through them. And then you've got to go for your short-term wins. Actually, don't go for a big change management suite. Don't try and win the war in one battle. Fight lots of little battles, generate these short-term wins. And then even then, you might think it's all over by then, but you've then got the sustainability thing, and the whole notion you've got to keep communicating all the time. That's the really hard bit, interestingly, to keep momentum and inertia going. And then the last one for him on the 8 is, I've forgotten it, it's changing, it's the whole anchoring. So you need to actually root the change into a permanent change. And that means anchoring it in your corporate culture to make sure you've got this sort of long-term sweep and success. Now, this took the world by fire, and I think rightly so, because I think it's pretty good. On the other hand, it's pretty linear. Everybody likes a steps thing, and the world is much messier and complicated than one might think. So perhaps Kotter oversimplified the complex dynamics of most organizations. Even small companies are a bit messy, a bit complex, and that this was too linear. And also, I think a reasonable critique of Kotter is the idea that this was still pretty top down. The idea that you have this group of leaders who say, right, we're going to change, and we all have to get into lockstep with their vision, and that they're sort of fooling us to go along with what they want to do anyway. And, that's sometimes at odds with some types of organizations, especially smaller companies or more entrepreneurial tech companies or whatever.
And you wonder about the creating a sense of urgency at the beginning of it. That I'm struggling to think of examples of this, but I just know that in the past, I've had a leader try and make me feel urgent about something, and the urgency is entirely ersatz. There isn't really any urgency.
No, that's right.
It's kind of our business is going to kind of disappear if we don't do X, Y, and Z, and you just feel they got it out of a book, and the book they got it out of was Kotter. On the other hand, there is something very nicely detailed about it, about how you form your kind of coalition and all the rest of it. And I think it brings us to a point where there's a word in all this stuff about leadership, which is almost never mentioned. And I'm going to mention it now, which is power. What leadership is power. It's about exercising power. It's about getting power, exercising power, keeping power.
Well, you're ahead of the beginner, John.
It's about that as opposed to management. And the kind of Kotter model does have some kind of nod towards that in terms of you need to look at your, we might call it stakeholder management. What is stakeholder management? Is underneath that, it's about negotiating the various pools of power and influence and so on within an organization, within a structure of people. For me, that's one of the things that's wrong with the whole leadership area, is it just shies away from the fact that power is what it's talking about.
Well, again, you're ahead of the game there, John. That's good. When we come to Kellerman after Mintzberg, then she's big on power. So we'll park that for the moment and come back to that very good point. And the second point you made there about, this seems to be imposed upon people, and that's right. There is creating this special cadre of leaders whom we should bow to whenever they want to change our lives dramatically. On the other hand, a good example is that, when a technological change, if you believe in Schumpeter, as I do, that technological change is a big driver, you have to bend with technology or else you'll be crushed by it. whether it's, and the big changes are the important one, like the internet comes along, and we worked in companies where you just had to do it. You have no choice, and you had to affect the change quickly, or you would be dead if all we were delivering were classroom courses and not online learning, for example. But the interesting thing about that is it needn't be a bad thing. So I think a good example would be Microsoft. So let's take the AI thing. Microsoft do something incredibly bold. They invest 10 billion in OpenAI, which is a not-for-profit startup. Boy, was that a change. It's reshaped the whole of Microsoft, but boy, has it worked. And that's an example of the leader within an organization or leadership team. It wasn't actually the leader there. It was another guy called Kevin Scott, who was the AI guy there who led the charge. Very interesting. It all came out when you had that management, when OpenAI sacked Sam Altman, and then they had to sack the board.
Yes, a very interesting case study.
It is fascinating. I've written a lot about that in my blog.
And Microsoft just made a really interesting hire, haven't they? It's Suleiman.
Yes, that's right. He's from DeepMind, so he's a real AI guy. You know, Microsoft have DeepMind. The Suleiman worked for DeepMind, so it wasn't so much a hire as a sort of, take him on board. Because what they've done is fold DeepMind into the main. But that's the sort of change management we've been discussing here.
Yes.
What's interesting about the leaders in those organizations, so if you look at DeepMind, so you have Dennis Hassabis, you have Suleiman and so on. These are really sort of brilliant mathematicians and AI people who really know their domain, but have also got to know business well. I mean, DeepMind is the beating heart of Google now, so... And Suleiman actually came out, you're right there, so he's sort of jumped ship, as it were. But we have a new species of people don't like this in leadership courses, of course, but you have to be honest that the big seven, look at who the leaders of the biggest companies on the planet are now. It's the words you never hear on the slides of a leadership trainer. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. These are idiosyncratic, very odd people, radically different. And of course, we paint this fridge magnet view of the perfect, leader who has lots of empathy and so on. These people are the very opposite very often. But of course, we ignore them because we don't like them. We have a sort of utopian idea of leadership that comes out of these fridge magnet books. But the next three people we're going to discuss they tackle that issue. Mintzberg, Kellerman.
Well, let's get on to that. Just one more point about that recent hire of Suleiman. The speculation was that the leader of Microsoft did that to balance off their overly dependence on Sam Altman.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. And I think that is a leadership case study in itself. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sam Altman is the big case study here, because this is an incredibly charismatic, experienced, hugely successful young person leading one of the biggest companies in the world and leading a sort of revolution in technology that may affect us as a species. But if you listen to Altman, he's not big on the traditional sort of, cliches around leadership. I mean, he's driving that. I mean, for him, his views on leadership are worth listening to. He thinks that leadership is all about drive and intellect. And so Musk thinks this is true as well. He said, what you want are people at the top who just live and breathe this 24 hours a day and keep driving things forward. That's their role. And that they also have to be very domain specific and very, very bright people who can handle uncertainty, complexity. That's a modern entrepreneurial view of a leader, which is what Dennis Hassabis is, what Steve Jobs was, what Elon Musk is, what Sam Altman is. Nobody's really tackled that issue, but it's the elephant in the room for all those people who deliver really terrible leadership courses. Ignoring the most successful leaders on the planet seems a bit odd to me.
Yes, and those are the people that we're really fascinated by at the moment. I mean, you talk about Musk, perhaps a little bit of impulse control wouldn't go amiss, but let's not get into that. Let's get on to the next of our people here. Henry Mintzberg, 1939 and still among us, born in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Henry Mintzberg graduated from McGill University with a degree in mechanical engineering and later earned his MBA and PhD from the MIT Sloan School of Management. Mintzberg has spent much of his academic career at McGill University. He's renowned for his work on business and management theory, particularly his classification of managerial roles and his critiques of strategic planning. He's also an avid birdwatcher. Donald, what's the verdict on Mintzberg? Is he a pious bird of good omen or a turkey?
Yeah, as a bird watcher, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think he's more of a cuckoo, really. He's the guy who comes along and really upsets the nest because he said, this leadership stuff is a bit bullshitty, really. I really like Mintzberg.
There's a palpable tone of relish in your introduction of him.
Yeah. Well, it's because he wrote this brilliant book. His first big book was called Managers, Not MBAs. He thought that the whole, superstructure of MBA leadership training was all wrong, and it had got us into big trouble. And boy, was he right in the 2008 financial crash. That's exactly what had happened, And he was quite predictive here, actually. He said, be careful with these business school people, because they'll do bad things, going back to the theme we discussed earlier. And who would deny that it was the business schools? I often make this point. It was actually higher education, the business schools in America, coming out of Chicago, Friedman and others, who actually said, hey, you business leaders, let's outsource everything to China because productivity and profits is all. And that actually happened. They fell lockstep into that terrible idea. And we wonder why we have Trump. So he was very predictive, I think. I really love Mintzberg because he thought this management leadership thing was a bit bullshitty. He really criticized the separation between the two. Because he thought it was all intertwined. He thought it was very complicated, something we've just discussed, that management and leadership were totally and utterly intertwined, and that leaders have to understand management has to understand leaders. But he wasn't big on leadership theories and certainly didn't like the promotion of leadership traits. In fact, although he did tend to fall back on his own concepts, like I think called communityship, which is a terrible word, but he preferred that over leadership. He thought leadership was like massively bloated, exaggerated, hierarchical, putting people on a pedestal, whereas communityship was the idea of a leadership as totally embedded in a group of people and have to take them forward. But there was more to Mintzberg than meets the eye, because he also thought it was dependent on the types of organizations. So we discussed that a little bit in previous theorists, but he thought there were 5 types of organizations. It's a bit modelish, this for me as well, but he thought there were very simple structures, like startups, for example, where you have a very low degree of departmentalization. Everybody mucks in and does lots of different little roles and jobs. You don't have an HR department or an L&D department. So he thought that simple structure was, you had to really understand what that was to lead one of those. Then you come up the ladder to machine bureaucracies, and these were the large manufacturing companies. Remember, he's a guy of his age, really. But I think if you've got assembly lines and process, then that's a second type of management that you have to implement. Then you come up to what you call professional bureaucracy in the third step. And that's these big, really service companies. You might say something like a hospital would be a good example of where you have to have a load of professionals, doctors, nurses, health professionals, and so on. And you have to herd the cats to make sure the whole thing works and delivers in a very structured fashion to patients. And then you've got the step even more, and you've got this divisional form. You've got these large, massive global companies, name them Sony, Hitachi, used to be GE, where you've got all these little different sub-companies and divisions, multiple divisions within an organization. Again, you've got finance, you've got manufacturing, R&D is a separate function even. I think you've got to be highly sensitive to that. And then his last one, which is a really weird word that I never get quite right, it's called adhocracy. People keep inventing words in management training, but actually that's your more flexible, adaptable tech company type world. An organizational structure that really relies a lot more on innovation and creativity. Much more dynamic, complex environments. Tech companies like Google would be a good example, as we've just discussed. The adhocracy. It's a weird word, but so this guy's highly critical of separation between management and leadership, but at least he's sensitive to the complexity of different species of companies needing different types of managers.
Barbara Kellerman. Barbara Kellerman, no birth dates there, was born and raised in the United States, a woman, and we don't have enough of those, so it's good to have a woman along here. She received her bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College and her master's and doctorate degrees in political science from Yale University. Kellerman has held professorships at various institutions, including Fordham University and Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Her research focuses extensively on leadership and followership. Followership, that's another word I've heard of, with numerous publications on the subject. Donald, her reputation is that she's a bit of a contrarian, but what does she have positively to contribute to our view of leadership?
Yeah, contrarian. I really love Barbara Kellerman, so I'm a fan. But I'd say, I mean, people who are just different and criticize the existing orthodoxy are often called contrarians. I would call her a realist. Yeah. It's interesting, her background was also in political science, I think, because she brings that dimension to her critique. And she wrote a really brilliant book called Bad Leadership, which I really loved. That was in the early 2004 was the first one. She wrote another one called The End of Leadership in 2012. Hardly anybody quotes Barbara Kellerman in a leadership course because she's critical of it. But that's what I mean about the leadership industry, the leadership industrial complex, let's call it, studiously ignores the people who actually have some really deep thoughts on the idea and that it might not be all it's cracked up to be. Now, she is highly critical in this, what she calls the 40 years. So it's now 50 years if you look at the 2004 book, 50 years of leadership theory. She's massively critical of it and goes way back in history. This is where her politics are interested. She looks at people like Machiavelli, political thinkers and writers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, and so on, and says, well, it's not as if this is new, this topic. Why aren't we looking at what we know about leadership in the past, just as we did, as some other people have, as we've discussed? Why don't we look at those? And she said, this great man theory of leadership is a bit odd. And she thinks that infects all of this leadership stuff. She thinks it's a bit too masculine. And I would wholly agree with her on that one. This whole notion that you've got to focus on the qualities and traits, as if leaders are statuesque people with really great features. And if only we identify those and distill them, all will be good. And of course, she discusses Hitler. Interestingly, she does actually discuss Hitler. And said, she says something really interesting in her lectures, which is I've seen several times. Hitler, she claimed, did not kill 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. A really stunning sentence. Of course, he didn't. And she's right. He didn't kill a single Jew, So the way we read history is often attributing agency and causality to an individual. When
I think we should say, though, that he didn't personally pull the trigger. We're not in the business of Holocaust denial here.
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, her point there is that we tend to put these leaders on weird pedestals and attribute causality to them in a way that's actually not historically true. Her historical analysis is really quite important here. Now, coming back to a word you mentioned earlier, John, brilliant, power. She thought that leadership, you really had to understand power. Well, the three again: power, authority, and influence. That's her triumvirate. She thinks those are the three legs of the stool for leaders, that they really have to understand those three things because that's what it's about. Now, she also refers to negative leaders as well, people like Putin, Xi Jinping, and Erdogan, and there are all sorts of people she doesn't like politically because she thinks they actually play to the leadership, that authoritarian populist view of the world that she's not too keen on. And Trump would be a good example there probably as well, because they're examples of leadership where they over-exercise personal power. She said, we build leadership up, we put people on pedestals, and then we're surprised when they become a bit dizzy with the power and start to become authoritarian. So she thinks that this Pollyanna world of leadership literature and training is the deep cause of all this stuff. And I think she's really right on this. She blames the leadership industry. She thinks it's a sort of 40-year aberration. She thinks it's all gone wrong. And that this focus on traits has been to the detriment of many organizations because we've had such bad leadership. They do bad things like outsourcing everything to China, like automatically bringing in cheap labor from abroad, denying jobs to the people who perhaps have been in those jobs all their life and built trade union structures and so on to defend their patch. So she's massively critical of the leadership in the industry and its courses and its centres, workshops and its books and its fridge magnets, but which she regards largely as a lot of rhetoric. But she's very precise on what she thinks has gone wrong in L&D and HR on this, and that is the notion, what she calls an attribution error. She thinks we think this is about attributes in human beings, and she thinks that's just false, because the sheer variety of people who lead organizations, the empirical evidence just doesn't support this. And so, and she also makes an interesting point that throughout the 21st century, we've recognized that we need a more devolution of power from the top into lower areas of the organization. We want flatter structures. Along comes this leadership thing and completely destroys that. It reintroduces a hierarchical term when we should be looking, for example, we have senior leadership teams in schools. They never existed when I was at school. That word leadership was never mentioned in schools. Now they're all over the place because they've adopted the corporate manner of hierarchical structures. This is against the grain of the wood, as it were, because everything in the 20th century is saying, well, no, let's flatten things out a little bit. That was the old model. So in bad leadership, and that I think this is the only book I know of that really tackles that issue. She actually lays it out. She has 7 types of bad leaders. Really, really fascinating, with real examples. So she starts off with really ineffective leaders, and you might say that you like the post office woman, Pauline Bennett. I mean, she was massively ineffective and ridiculously poor at what she did. Then there are the rigid leaders. Who would be rigid? Maybe an Elon Musk or something, everything has to be physics. My way or the highway type people. Yeah. There are intemperate leaders, people like Trump, who are just all over the place and emotional. And I think you have these insular. I remember seeing this in the Royal Bank of Scotland. When that one went bad, that was a bunch of very insular people at the top who regarded themselves as locking themselves away into the room and planning the next battle or takeover.
Robespierre.
Yes, plenty of examples from more than enough examples of that in the past. Then you got straight up corrupt people like Bernie Madoff or whatever, Philip Green. People who just rip money out of organizations and enrich themselves. It gets really bad because she then goes into the sort of real callous people. People who just don't care about the havoc they wreak on the ground. And I've seen that in my lifetime. Like the people who sacked all the P&O ferry people. And, this happens even now. We have these leaders who think it's all about, they're quite happy to destroy people's lives just to get that little bit extra productivity, reducing costs. And then the straightforward evil people, who would be evil, John? I think, the Russian oligarchs or Epstein or something, the people who are way out there. And let's not imagine that this is not new, because never have we had so much rhetoric, books and training courses and leadership, but so little of it. Look around us, whether it's politics, sport, business, everywhere we have this horrible pedestal type leaders who lead us up the garden path to very unpleasant places. So this is why I admire Kellerman.
Before we rush onwards, should we perhaps mention followership, which is something that comes up a bit. I've always felt that, where I've gone wrong in life is I just don't have any followership. I'm not very good at wanting to have a job. I like to be a freelancer and basically have a bad attitude. But so tell me more about followership, because I think I ought to learn.
Well, this is why I love Wittgenstein. And my whole idea around this is why so much training seems irrelevant to me, that language is promiscuous. As soon as you have the word leadership, you have followers. You have this sort of binary thinking, incredibly simplistic. And I really dislike the word followers as well. I mean, it sounds like a cult, not a company or an organization, not a follower. Imagine going to, in fact, I often say this, you walk into a bar and somebody says, oh, and you introduce me to your friend, I've never met him before. I say, what do you do? And he goes, well, actually, I'm a leader. I go, get out of here. You certainly have a very dim view of that reply. As you would if somebody said, well, what do you do? Well, actually, I'm a follower in my organization. You go, what? Are you kidding me? This language is totally inappropriate and ridiculous. However, to be fair, this is the aspect of Kellerman I don't like much. She was big on followers. To be fair, what she did was, she's a political animal. She took something, it is not her idea. Most people think the follower thing was her idea, not at all. She actually took something from a political scientist called Eldersveld. It was a political science idea about political participation. So there were 5 types of followers, and just quickly say what they are. These 5 followers, remember this comes from the political world, she applied to business. I'm not too sure it's true. She thought they were isolates. These are individuals in an organization that are completely disengaged from what's happening. And you always see people like that, who just basically turn up for work, want to get their salary and get on with it. I always admire that.
Quitters, refuseniks.
Yeah, no, they're not so much refuseniks as they're just not engaged.
Engaged.
You get that in politics, people who don't vote and can't be bothered with it all. I have some sympathy with that. I think that, but she certainly regarded those as isolates in her organization. Then there were the bystanders, the people who didn't participate but sort of stood on the side. They're aware of what's happening in the organization, but stand to the side and let it happen to them. So that's isolates, bystanders. Other types of followers are participants. Here you get people who are a wee bit active in all this and occasionally get involved in whatever the change is within the organization, normally at the management class, of course. Then you have activists who are more deeply involved. This is all the language of politics. You can hear it, but she applies it to companies, or this is her taxonomy of followers. So the activists are people who get really deeply involved in a change management program or the direction in which the company is going, are very vocal about it, want to be involved. That's not a bad thing. It's a very good thing, I think. They bring agency to the table. And then there are what you call the diehards. It's a weird term. And these are people who are really intensely engaged with things. They're got deep commitment to everything. And they're, potentially to the point of personal sacrifice almost, they go this ridiculously over the top. But they tend to be what she calls the leaders, the organizers, the ones who push for change in organizations. And that the isolates, bystanders, participants, activists are more like the followers. So she has a theory of followership. This is where it goes a wee bit wrong for me, really. But to be fair to Kellerman, her conclusion out of this is she thought that the idea was ridiculous that everybody should be a leader, thereby rendering the word completely meaningless. And even its linguistic use falls apart then. Because she thought actually most people are various types of followers. But I think that's just falling into a really false binary between leaders and followers.
Yeah, sounds a bit to me like a situation comedy, or one of those, with apologies to our US listeners, Dad's Army.
Yes.
You have these kind of archetypes of different, and so many kind of 70s UK sitcoms, which would be set in a department store, and you have various types of employee. Some are very keen, some are hardly disengaged, some like to snipe from the side, and so on. It feels like it's devolving into that kind of thing. But just another note on what made me think about something you said earlier, where you were talking about leadership, was that it can be quite culty. I think that one of the problems with the whole idea of leadership is when you start to look at leaders and traits of leaders. Charles Manson had the gift of leadership, clearly, and yet no moral compass. You wouldn't say that about a manager, would you? You would say, does Charles Manson manage well? It just wouldn't come up. But leadership is full of these actually examples of really quite terrible people. And it gets down. I'd love to hear what evolutionary biology says about leadership, actually, and evolutionary psychology rather.
Yes,
about leadership, because then you're kind of talking about primate behavior, and we see a lot of that.
Well, that's right. So we have some quite big theorists in there, famously Merlin Donald and Geary have written 2 major books on this that are really worth reading in terms of, we did our evolutionist podcast covering,
yes,
in particular. There's also Merlin Donald, who actually does more of this type of speculation about the phases in which our societies go through. But you picked up on something there that I think is important, the danger here is this sort of, I don't want to take this too far, but these minor cults of leadership in organizations. This is what this training, the problem here is academia likes to produce these books with these very highly structured models, whether there's steps or sequences or process or archetypes, because that's what you need for the book. And trainers love this because that's what you put on the PowerPoint, and you need that for a course. So the danger here is we go up these cul-de-sacs based on really rather ropey models and books that are quite often unsubstantiated to create these leadership courses that are fictions. And suddenly we start calling people followers because the model demands that. This strikes me as foolhardy.
Geoffrey Pfeffer, 1946, still among us. Geoffrey Pfeffer was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He completed his bachelor's degree in business administration at Carnegie Mellon University and his PhD in organizational behavior from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he has been a long-standing faculty member. Pfeffer's work concentrates on organizational behavior and theory, and is known for his books on power and management practices. That word, it's turned up at last, including Power, Why Some People Have It and Others Don't. Donald, this is certainly not the Dolly Parton style of leadership, but it is a more realistic take on whatever leadership is all about. I'm sure Dolly knows a thing or two about power. So tell us about Pfeffer and his ideas.
Well, out of all the theorists we're discussing today, this is my favorite. In fact, my favorite book on leadership is his book, Leadership BS. Not Leadership is BS, just Leadership BS. And what he meant by this was that we've built up this body of rhetoric, airport books and courses, but it's all a house of cards. And what he is a real empiricist, going back to hard evidence here. In fact, I think the first thing in management he wrote was called Hard Facts or something. I can't remember the title now. But what he does is sort of dismiss the popular business wisdom around leadership by saying there is nothing in this, guys. When you look at it, well, there is some stuff. So he writes the book in 2015. So this is relatively recent. He's had time. He's read everything in the field, and he's going, "Wow, this is very strange. All these books I'm reading and all these theories are really almost completely unsubstantiated by evidence." That's his first point. But he says, actually, but nevertheless, they make these, even though the world is very, very complicated and messy, as we've discussed, they are full of, and his language is great. He thinks they're just full of these glib statements and simplicities, these bromides, all these promises and, nostrums. It's all based on the romanticism around this one word of leadership. He said, but why? It's myth-making, it's storytelling. It's feel-good nonsense. He thinks that's what passes for leadership, and I've come to agree with him. This book was a real eye-opener for me personally. It really sort of hit the nail right on the head. So, first of all, in the opening of the book, he says, "Listen, there's a villain here, and that's the leadership industry. The leadership industry actually created this nonsense, and what he does is look." Even though we have study after study after study showing that the workplace is a terrible place, it's full of discontented people, okay? And that often leads to the disastrous collapse of business sometimes. But this has been on the back of this cult of leadership, because it doesn't work. In fact, there is almost a willful anti-intellectualism in all this, trying to avoid the evidence and the measurement and the real measurement of the data here. So it's very hard-hitting, this, and a bit depressing, but nevertheless, he suggests that the very construct of leadership and much of the leadership consultancy and training, which he doesn't like at all, was invented as something to sell, a bit like Myers-Briggs in the past and, all those things that we see popping up in training, learning styles, in other words, it becomes a marketing game, becomes a bit of a pyramid scheme. He thinks that leadership training has become this. Now, he is particularly damning on leadership courses because he thinks they're by and large led by consultants and trainers who have never led anything other than the workshops, So he said, well, that's a bit telling. And then when he examines those courses, they're full of storytelling and anecdotes lifted from books or the internet or whatever. He said, that's telling. He said, you don't have substance here. Actually, what you get is a whole lot of like unaccountable theory. And he thinks that's quite dangerous because actually you're just bumping people up for failure. You know, you're telling them everything will be back when they go back to the ranch. They go back to the ranch and nothing happens. So it's been a waste of money. Actually reduces productivity. And so, you know, it has this cult-like feeling that if you don't behave like this, you will not be a leader. You're not on board. If you don't have these values, you don't do this. If you don't have empathy, sympathy, strangely enough, it's a bit didactic about things that are a bit sort of touchy-feely in a way.
Yeah.
Now it gets really interesting later in the book because he looks at leadership traits and goes, it's mostly nonsense. So he takes, I think the first one is modesty. He goes, that's the last thing you want in somebody leading an organization. And he quotes, he hates the book, The Productive Narcissist. It's quite a famous book around 20 years ago or so. And he said, this is just nonsense. You know, what you need is actually energy, confidence, and dominance and stuff in leaders, not modesty. Modesty doesn't help at all. And then he hits that great word you mentioned earlier, John, authenticity, a word he despises in leadership. It's this ridiculous idea that, you know, when you go into a restaurant and we've given all the people who serve there a course in leadership and that they should be authentic. Imagine if every waiter and waitress or server in the world spoke to you authentically. That would be a bit of a nightmare, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I really want to be an actor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I really hate you because you're rich and condescending.
Yeah. Reread my novel.
That's right. And the same is true, of course, he thought of people-led companies. I personally led a PLC, you know, I was on the market. It would have been catastrophic if I had been authentic in everything I said in the sense of telling everybody everything, because your competitors would have ripped you to shreds, your investors would have fled, you know. So, and then this is what I loved about this book. He used that phrase that I mentioned earlier, the delicious irony of L&D training or leadership trainers training people to be authentic. So I thought, it's become surreal when we get to that level. Now, he also has a really interesting chapter on trust where he says, you've got to be really careful with trust. Do you really trust lawyers? Do you trust your competitors? Do you trust even people within your organization? There might be some politicking type managers that you don't trust. Trust was what led to Bernie Madoff. Trust is not necessarily the currency of everything in an organization. You need to be alert to people who you might not want to wholly trust, who are maybe after promotion or you know, have some other personal goal as opposed to the goal of the organization, or even deceptive. You have to protect the organization sometimes from that. Trust is not everything it seems. We have a really sophisticated chapter in the book on that one. And of course, as he constantly says, there are so many counterexamples to any leadership course in terms of, you know, as we've already mentioned, Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Musk. You know, everybody hates Musk. He's by far the most successful leader, having revolutionized about 4 or 5 sectors single-handedly. The CEO of about 7 massive companies. And yet we never mention him because we don't like him. So that contradiction there of ignoring people who have been massively successful in leadership, you know, the top 7 companies don't have very nice people as leaders, but they're the top 7 companies on the planet. How did that happen? But the big thing for Pfeffer underlying it, which is where his serious analysis comes in, is he thinks this is a complexity problem. So organizations are complex, very complex. And this leadership, this, you know, these courses are full of little stories and anecdotes and simplicity, simple models. It doesn't work. You've got to really get people to understand the uncertainty and complexity is the currency in these organizations, and adaptability. But he has some concrete recommendations on this. You know, he's a professor in this area and understands it. He thinks you have to build your power base. Yeah, but embracing ambiguity is a big one for him, and I wholly agree with that. And when the situation demands change, you change and you adapt. You know, so it's not that leadership training is all wrong; it just gets things wrong by focusing on traits and models and steps and followership. He doesn't really like that stuff. He thinks it's we really have to understand the psychology of complexity and uncertainty.
Yeah, and I mean, and things like trust become an absolute. You know, the leader has to be
Yeah,
absolutely trustworthy. Well, in the real world, trust is conditional, isn't it?
yeah.
You trust people to a certain degree and in certain circumstances. And, you know, you ask that question when you look at a politician, how far could I throw him?
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems to me that we've arrived at a place where the dominant model of leadership learning in organization now is being called out as a rather idealized and unrealistic model that doesn't
Yeah,
really connect with what's happening in actual organizations and governments and in real life.
correct.
So is it, Donald, that there's been a, you know, I'm going to offer a couple of alternatives here. Is it there's been a progressive movement underway, well-intentioned, but in the final analysis, a bit quixotic, to make a better world, one business manager at a time? You know, in other words, people are saying that this is what the manager should be, this is what, you know, the leader should be, these are the ideal values they espouse. And really it's one intention, but perhaps a bit unrealistic. Or is it a bit more dysfunctional than that? Is it a set of rigidly enforced norms and habits of speech about leadership that everybody knows is BS, but no one wants to change because the alternative would be just too Machiavellian in character to contemplate? In other words, we'd kind of have to own up to a picture of the world that nobody wants to put on a PowerPoint. Which of those two is it, do you think? Is it, you know, hypocrisy or well-meaningness that's gone wrong?
Yeah, well, interestingly, Pfeffer actually quotes Machiavelli, you know, 16th century, the prince.
Well, he knew a thing or two.
And the interesting thing of it, Pfeffer says something interesting here just to kick this summary off. He said, actually, it's sometimes necessary as a leader to do bad things to achieve good results. That's how complex this is. It's a really interesting line, that, because leaders need, what it means is leaders need to be pragmatists. And I think that's right. That's really summing Pfeffer up here. But I mean, I think you've lifted the stone up there. Let's look under the stone and see what creepy crawlies are there. I think one thing that did happen, and I saw this happen myself because I work in this sector, you saw L&D suddenly grab an opportunity, leadership, because how often have you heard, the whole training and L&D thing, we never get a place at the top table, it's all about alignment with the business. Suddenly they saw this opportunity of being aligned by appealing to the narcissism of senior people in organizations and saying, listen, we're going to take our budget and we're going to spend it on you because you're really important. You're a leader. Okay? So I think they felt as though it made them feel good. It made the leaders feel good. Let's all backslap the people at the top, spend lots of money on managers, not much on traditional training, which is all the competence, and no wonder the world's falling apart. We've got leaders galore, but we don't have people who can actually do things because we've spent all the money on leadership courses or DEI courses or other abstract nouns. And so I think the idea here is that you've got to be really careful with these normative wish lists, where the evidence, the realities of the workplace is actually you really need to train a waiter, waitress, or server how to do the job properly, and not try and pretend, by the way, I know you're only working in Starbucks, but you're now a leader, and you really need to be authentic to people, and you really need to understand values like trust. It's all just completely irrelevant, really. It's platitudes. That's the problem here. In the place of realism comes platitudes, nostrums, anecdotes, glib stuff.
So I think what you're saying there is that it was a power move on behalf of L&D.
Yeah, by focusing on the few and not the many. And so the many are getting scant attention, the people who actually need all the training for all those nuts and bolts competence type stuff. And you can see this when you walk into a restaurant or a coffee shop. People can barely function in terms of communicating with you about what you want because they have received no training. But boy, have the people at the top gone through their leadership courses. So a disproportionate amount of the budget was spent on the wrong people, on these elusive leadership traits and structures and processes that nobody remembers. It's not how the mind works. You don't call out these structures. We don't think of words like, oh, yes, I'm in adhocracy. I'm a follower. None of this applies to cognition. So why do it, you know? And in a funny sort of way, we're making the fat cats fatter in organisation and not helping the people who really need help, you know? I don't call people leaders. They don't call themselves leaders. The word's embarrassing. So I think I myself would like to, you know, call it out a little bit and maybe end some of the cult aspects of it and maybe get back to more management. You know, the nuts and bolts of management, I think, are a good thing.
So we should go back to management training.
Yeah, it's what all this was, to be honest.
And this kind of hieratic function of the leader. Right. So, and really, it does sort of feel a bit like a priesthood, doesn't it? It sort of makes me think of an educational establishment where you have teachers, but the teachers are monks.
Yes.
And some of the teachers are monks and some of them aren't. And, you know, there are these schools. And they're a different class of human beings. The teachers, you know, go away, poodle off in their
almost like a
expensive cars at the end of the day. But the monks are there. They're really there to kind of inspire and to sort of grow people's souls. And
yeah, I'd like to see it calm down a bit, you know, so we maybe stop more at this, what I see something sometimes quite divisive, superior attitude towards training and focus on the actual needs of people as organisation and not see them as armies led by generals, you know, albeit nice generals with lots of empathy. You know, the sort of general and officer class thing that you see, it's almost as if we're trying to recreate that. But the first sign of true leadership is maybe to stop calling yourself and other leaders. You know, the language is odd. Has a cult-like quality. I think that's been teased out as we've gone through these, from its explosion through the sort of airport books at the beginning, from Burns and Drucker and so on. Then calmer, more critical voices come to the fore in the 21st century, and we've looked at them very definitely. And I've found them to be incredibly useful, especially Mintzberg, but also Kellerman, although I disagree with the followership thing. And of course, I think the master of the critique here is Jeffrey Pfeffer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And that Leadership BS book is a nice big full stop for me in this because it calls it out.
Yeah. You know, what's really surprised me about this episode, Donald, is I kind of realized with the earlier ones like Drucker and so on, how useful those thinkers were, because they were updating what was happening within organizations and, you know, updating the idea of how you manage these large and complex organizations as the world was changing, as industry was changing, technology was revolutionizing everything.
Yeah.
And so I kind of have a renewed respect for some of that leadership literature there.
I wholly agree with that. I think, you know, a good example is Kotter. As companies, it used to be the job for life, stable, big manufacturing, giant global companies. That world suddenly changed into the level of uncertainty went through the roof. The place became, change happened faster and faster and faster. And boy, with AI, it's still happening. So Kotter comes in with something that actually proves to be quite useful, but couching it under the term of leadership was a bit weird. It was a way of getting it in there, of course, more marketing than science. But nevertheless, you can certainly pluck out. I mean, I think, I don't think anybody could look at the issue of change management without at least looking at some of the really useful ideas that Kotter put on the table, and other people have built on that, critiqued it, refined it. Same is true of Drucker. Drucker brought to the fore the professionalism of management, how we had to take that very seriously because it mattered in terms of people's lives and the future of organizations, whether they be in the public or private sector. There's lots of really good stuff here, but the pedestal leadership stuff was created by L&D by and large and HR, and it's clearly not working because look at the levels of dissatisfaction around what, and people use the word leaders all the time, but actually it's usually because they want to criticize them.
Okay. I now have to bring another fictional construct to bear on the discussion, which is the ultimate fiction that there is an ending to this discussion because we have to close up now. Thank you very much, Donald. It's been a wild ride and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, great. So did I, John. Thanks very much.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you'd like text summaries and transcripts for these podcasts, as well as ads-free listening, early access to episodes and more, why not join the Learning Hack Pack? For less than the price of a coffee, you can get all these benefits and help to sustain us into the future. Go to patreon.com/learninghack for a 7-day free trial. That's patreon.com/learninghack.